I want to thank you all for coming. As most of you know, my name is Judith DeMaio, and I am the Dean of the New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, I would like to make the following comments, which most of you are familiar with. First, remember to turn off your cell phones. That means I better do that too. Second, as stated in our invitation, we are an AIA CES registered provider. So make sure that as AIA members and registered architects, you've signed on the forms downstairs. So you can get, I believe it's 1 credit. If you haven't signed up already, the forms will be available downstairs. There may be 2 forms, one for registered architects and one for AIA members. I'm not sure, they keep changing that. I would also like to thank Jennifer Mitchell, who's downstairs receiving guests, and Lori Kellner, and we have a student representative helping. And of course, I'd like to thank Kaylee and Steelcase for letting us use their wonderful space for our most special events. And Calvin is in that category. I would like to read, you all have the bio of Calvin's, but it's so short, and I have to read the first sentence because it's so apt. Calvin Tsao is recognized as one of the most original voices in contemporary architecture, drawing from his own experience of diverse cultures and a lively engagement with a variety of art forms. In terms of the accolades below that, you can read them for yourselves. For my own part, I welcome Calvin here as both a great friend. Whenever I see Calvin, I smile, and as an esteemed architect. We know each other. We kind of crossed paths at Harvard graduate school, and then I don't know exactly where we sealed our fate as friends. I'm not quite sure. But in any event, Calvin has an incredible eye, an incredible sensibility, incredibly professional, is also not only a great professional, but an educator. And I can't say much more except that I'm really happy that Calvin is my friend and my colleague, and I'd like you all to welcome him here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Judy. I feel like a nightclub act. Stand up. Anyway, I have to say that standing here in front of my esteemed colleagues, but most of all, I'm very thrilled to be talking to your students. It always brings me back to when we were students. And I was not an architectural undergrad, and somehow fell into architecture. And all I can say is the architecture, the education, and the learning, and architecture, the profession, sometimes seem like 2 separate things. But what's so wonderful about the education is, in fact, I would like to invite you to think outside of the discipline of glass and stone and steel and structures, but think much more broadly and think of architecture, the word being someone who can mastermind things. And you can never, you can always apply that discipline and thinking to issues small and large. So today I just want to share with you some of the things that we've done going through that journey. So I'm going to first start with clothes. The first line of defense, that's a facade of sorts. You know how important clothing is in terms of determining our identity, but it is also materiality. So the first, the clicker, no clicker? Okay, so I have to say next. Okay, so next. We started exploring how to use a minimum of means, even something as highly charged as fashion and clothing. So we look at how to do zero waste design. This is just 1 tube of fabric, 24 by 54 inches, and stitched along that way. Next, and that's what it looks like, and that's the back. Then next. And then we started importing some historical details, like a ruff and say how can look at classical types of clothing and still apply this kind of sensibility of zero waste. So this is a piece of fabric, albeit a piece of jersey, so we take advantage of the stretch quality of the material next. And these are darts, and you just sew along those dotted lines and put a zipper through it and cut some armholes, and that's what you get, the dress before. Next. So from there, we started looking at how to present this sense of identity, the first kind of shelter clothing through an exhibition here about the intersection between architecture, actually, and fashion. Next. And we started thinking about, again, zero waste. And this is before a laser cutting, and we actually took a piece of steel and water jet cut these slices and turned it into a shoe display for a store. Next. Then we explore ethnicity and modernity in the form of furniture. Next. The early designs were quite extravagant, very custom, very much depending on the craft of the woodworkers. And then this is the other extreme where we're thinking, well, what do you do with very inexpensive materials like MDF and looking at behavioral qualities of children and their way they use support system, if you will, for sitting, leaning, lounging. And these are actually developed for these New York school library effort that was spearheaded by Robin Hood Foundation. Next. These are at a moment when there wasn't a popular application of internet stations and airports and other public places, and these are our modular units that we thought that were developed to put along less used spaces in airports and other terminals. And they can be dismantled and then linked like a train. Next. We started looking at other utilitarian objects like tabletops, and started thinking, applying architectural thinking like figure ground, the semiology or this of table service. What does a pattern mean? So we're playing with borders and centers, and also grafted those thoughts onto color and food. And so we deconstructed a favorite architectural word and strategy, the five-piece place setting, and changed the color, changed the pattern in every piece to look at what the notion of a setting is about, as well as how does different plate services deals with the food and the color of the food that it's been served on. Next. Then we went the other way, which is instead of designing custom patterns, is to go to the factory and find existing molds, but in this case looking at how we eat today, which is no longer along traditional ethnic or cultural lines. We may eat a bowl of udon next to, and then there's a bowl of cereals, or pig out with a large plate of buffet, or nurse a large mug of coffee or tea. So we threw away place settings like items like demi-tasse or coffee cups, and went with 5 easy pieces that are globalized, globalizing different food groups. So you have an American coffee mug, a Japanese udon bowl, a Chinese rice bowl, a sandwich plate, and a large buffet plate. And unified these different utensils and by putting a single color on all of them. And so it's really working with existing materials and making a social observation about how we eat. Next. In terms of style, which is one of those strange words that people are always obsessed with, what's your style, what's your look, what's your identity, we are actually quite pluralistic and Catholic about it. We think that the whole world cannot be solved with one aesthetic, one strategy. And so we work with whatever we've got. This is a wall sconce we developed for a hotel in Thailand, and it's working with local found materials like seashells and working with local craftsmen. To next. To a found object, these are egg sorters that we found at Brimfield, totally useless object now, and turn it into a light. Next. Or try to explore the whole ritual of lipstick and its application. And we noticed that most of Our Lady friends are always fumbling through their purses looking for the right shade, and you can't see it, and they usually have 2 or 3 lipsticks in their bags. Don't know why, but anyway. And also there's times when they can't apply it right, so they have to get a compact. It's a whole rigmarole. And so when we were approached by this Japanese brand who already have a fairly minimal aesthetic, we thought it was a perfect chance to explore that condition. So we created actually a totally transparent case. The lucite, or the plastic that's done, has been buffed on one side to a sheen, so you can actually use the cover as a mirror. And at the same time, of course, being a designer of stores, we're quite aware how each item could actually be shown to its best advantage in that context. So we're trying to kill many birds with one stone. Next. Of course, I think most people think of our company office as being a interior design-centric firm, and it may be so. We do love the emotions of interior spaces, and there too, we don't think there is one look that everyone can subscribe to. So I'm going to just run through a series of images. Next. Okay, so they kind of speak for themselves. They just are eye candy, I guess. So when we started thinking about internal spaces, of course, you can't really ignore external. So we started doing a series of homes in that kind of domestic scale and work ourselves back up. I actually started my career in large office of Richard Meyer and I.M. Pei. One of my colleagues are here tonight, which is pretty remarkable. But so it goes to show you that, in fact, I have to retrain myself entirely to do all the things that I showed you just now, including these houses. And that's the magic of our education. We start, sort of releasing ourselves from the didactic, polemic, ideological to phenomenal, emotional, and psychological aspects of architecture. So houses, domestic landscape is, of course, rich and charged with these qualities. And so this is a house we did up in Western Massachusetts, and the whole exercise of how to create a kind of sense of enclosure, sense of warmth against the harsh and grand landscape that it's set in. Next. Here is a house in California, almost opposite, when you need the desire is to open the house out into the landscape, and how the house can be in fact blended into the landscape. Next. This is a very interesting house because it had no client. It's a theoretical house that was part of a study or investigation by a very, I can't describe, a developer who has a very broad sense of what architecture can do. And he commissioned 34 architects under the guidance of Richard Meyer to look at the American domestic landscape for the 21st century. And this is our entry into it. And we thought that, in fact, when we think about American household today, we are kind of ambivalent about where we want to be. There's once a sense of not want to have a McMansion, but we certainly do still want to keep up with the Joneses and show what we are. We want our privacy, but we also want to show off our house. We want small, but our needs are huge. So we call this a kind of diptychal house, but within our office, we jokingly call it the bipolar house, but hopefully it's not dysfunctional that way. It's really about pulling these dichotomies together. So the house is actually the master complex for the owners, the parents, is a 30 by 30 cube with 2 levels, and it has public entertainment spaces, the parlor, if you will, the fancy kitchen that you entertain in, and the master suite with his and hers everything. And then excavated into the ground and not seen from the street is a whole different house, which incorporates visitors, in-laws, children, rec rooms, a spa, media, entertainment, and so on. And it is conceived as a kind of messy, very private part of the house. That house is really, actually the family who lives in it, in fact, appreciates that, which is a lucky break, because we didn't know whether you can really design a house ideologically without really serving an end user. Next. From an architecture point of view, this is also our exploration to integrate both a rational aspect, a very, which we describe, how to reconcile all these issues, but also there's an attempt at a kind of Baroque whimsy. So this room, the guest room, you can actually get out of bed, slide open the sliding door, and jump and swim across the pool to the other side where there's a rain shower. And so it's almost kind of decadent, if you will. But we think that we're not that kind of militant about both being responsible, like we said earlier, about zero waste and all, because there are times when you need that whimsy. So next. We're jumping up to scale. In scale, this is a residential building in Tribeca, a neighborhood that really doesn't, unlike the West Village, really have a constituency, a population that really doesn't want to show off. And when we went to the community board, the message we got back was, please don't give us a loud, clear glass box. And even though it's not in a historical district, we decided to honor that desire and use the tradition and the heritage of Tribeca as a warehouse-centric neighborhood, and created a building that most people will drive right by and not know it's a new building, without being retro, I believe. So next. On the other hand, there are buildings that we are very custom built to the identity of a client. This is a corporate headquarters of our company in Malaysia. And here we're looking at the intersection between external and internal needs. The culture at that place is of Kuala Lumpur or in Malaysia was at a point when women are entering the workplace when the building was being built, and there really no way at the time for women to choose home or work because the workplace is so male dominated in terms of functions. So in fact, in this building, we try to shape the identity, or what you call the branding of that corporation, by convincing them to put in a lot of functions that cater to that new work population, and also to look at economically how to serve vertically all the people who could work there. So there are very fancy clubhouse for the executives on the roof, and then there are, like in the roof of the garage, what they call a hawker center, which is you can eat very cheaply outside, and we brought, like on the High Line here, stalls from the city to sell food up there. So, and also, of course, there was a daycare center and also a children's learning. So we begin to understand that a building is inert and it becomes alive when you put cues in on how they can be used. And all of a sudden, an office building is no longer just a place of work alone, but a place where you can bring children, you can actually stay there at lunch hour rather than having to go somewhere to find food. Next. This is, on the other hand, something very different. It's that yellow building, you probably know it. It's jokingly called the Post-it building. It wasn't our intention, but this is talking about texture of fabric, literally fabric of the city. It's down in Wall Street. The building wanted some sense of place within the crowded forest that's downtown, and also as it is a commercial development. The budgets are quite tight, so, and the zoning envelope really allows you very little to do anything in terms of sculpturing the volume. So we decided to look at, in fact, textiles as a way of making itself seen and present among its neighbors. But it's also important to know that this building too has those qualities that, like the building that we did in Malaysia, which is it's embedded with the notion of a building as a vertical social neighborhood. So it has, for example, all the amenities on the street. There's a cafe, there's a deli, there are libraries, there's a screening TV room, there are children's daycare, there are covered dog runs, there are, of course, gyms. And we're able to convince through figuring out, and I'm not a good numbers guy, but we managed to crunch numbers with their financial people and realize that if we take one unit on the roof and not sell it and turn it into a communal space, the value that you get being able to either people use it by day, and just at night maybe you need to rent it and pay an amount of money if you're a neighbor. That offering has enough premium that you can be offset. The cost of loss of revenue by not selling this is offset by increasing dollar per square foot sale per every unit that remains by adding $1.50. So you add $1.50 per square foot to each apartment per square foot. That becomes an amenity. So I think behind any intention to make civic good, there has to be some sort of way of dealing with the economics of things, living in a capitalist society, that is. Next. This is one of our first major projects, and Ken may know this. It's in Singapore, and this is done in the 80s, actually. It's a very old project. I just want to bring it up to show you the fact that there's a landfill, reclaimed land that was not very well utilized, and we recognize the fact that in terms of roads and circulation, it was at the convergence of three very important corridors, urban corridors, and we managed to work within a civic, public-private partnership with a developer and the Singapore government to create the first civic space in Singapore. Next. And because Singapore is populated by three very disparate cultures, the Chinese, the Malays, and the Indians, with the Chinese being in a kind of privileged role, we wanted to see how we can find a public space that honors all of them. So we actually looked at the Indian mandala, which is also part of Malay lore, and the Chinese, of course, also understand the notion of geomancy, or as you know it, feng shui. So they all actually, all these mythologies shares common knowledge of orientation and groundings, and so the building was actually planned with those principles in mind. Next. And even though the building looks like a modern set of buildings, at its core, its DNA is about celebrating these kinds of folkloric traditions. And next. And next. And of course, we deal with things like portals and entryways and balancing the economics through high rises as well as streetscapes. But the most important thing is the ability to convince all the parties next, next, that we would spend this fun to do a public space with this fountain that is actually deals with micro climate. It's very hot there, and by using the runoffs from the mechanical systems, we're able to create an inverted fountain that brings air and cool air into the lower levels, which connect to all the buildings. So you have an underground network of pedestrian interlinks, all culminating to this public space that's free from vehicular traffic, and is a pride of place and of this this neighborhood. So sometimes you, as an architect, you're really conflicted by wanting to do civic good, but at the same time bringing profit to mercenary desires. And how can you do both? And we certainly struggled and managed to have some sense of accomplishment here. And currently, this space is their Times Square, in the sense that at holidays, Chinese New Year's, Christmas, that's the place of celebration. Next. And they also use it, the platform, the fountain is actually also equipped with lighting and sound opportunities. So this shows actually a dance company taking advantage of the space. And of course the fountain can be turned off, but they were actually turned on by the idea that they could dance in this super wet environment. Next. So it's kind of interesting. Next. Moving to the other side of the world is a project we worked on with the government of Budapest with a brownfield area. What they had was a power plant up there, that is a beautiful example of 30s architecture. So we actually looked at how to clean up the bay, but also look at an opportunity with 45 acres to look at how to create a mixed-use enclave. The important thing here is that in Budapest, there's some beautiful buildings in old downtown. They're trying to renovate it and make it contemporary, but they didn't have the economic wherewithal to really do it right. And our proposal here would say, maybe this is not time to restore these old buildings, the purpose of which had to be carefully rethought, so you don't just take a beautiful building and turn it into a hotel, or turn it into an office building, or turn it into something that may not be typologically compatible with these buildings. And this, creating a new project on the edges of a city, allows you to give the old city, relieve it of its pressure to be restored and renovated, and yet at the same time bring some new building mixes that allows a contemporary community to thrive. So in here, next, we start looking at, of course, Budapest and its relationship to its neighboring country, the economics, the connectivity, the political relationships. In the EU, it's really important to know where they stand next. And then of course, all the networks in terms of who they're connected to next. And then start looking at road networks, rail networks next, ferry networks along the Danube next, subways next, and here's a site along the Buda's on the north, Pest is in the south next, and then look at it, and then you zero in on the existing network, its potential and its short side, the neighborhood context, who's living where, what are the social and economic demographics next. And then we started looking at fashioning a whole inner network and how that hooks into the broader context. So there are ferries, ferry terminals, rail connections, bike lanes, pedestrian thoroughfares, all kind of very fine-grained. So as you can see, you start with a big picture and then you go back to the small picture next. And start looking at roads, just like what we've done here these few years, which are wonderful, is to recontextualize different kind of roads, scales, next. As of course, looking at the height of the buildings to the width of a road, all that, looking at what could energize a community. Something could be very tacky, like a water park, We're thinking, well, something temporary like that, or a farmer's market, might be able to bring some new sense of place, because that location has been abandoned for decades, and it's hard to bring people in. And rather, first investing in new buildings is actually bringing some attention to that place, the way we have Brooklyn Flea on the waterfront, or stuff like that. So next, and looking at, of course, all the things you're familiar with now. This is a 5-year-old project. Actually, city-owned bikes of still 5 years ago was a rarity. I think Paris was the first one, only at the time, to do that. And try to bring all that knowledge here, and also look at how you can animate streets and what are the layers of animation you can get next. And then start just thinking about when you can't go ta-da, even if you have all the money in the world, you don't do instant cities, I feel, and we will talk about it later. And so we'll look at what the pieces are: live, work, live, play, work, conferences, or sort of business exchange, and cultural activities. So we started looking at different ways of wrapping this area. So the historical power plant is still there, and then we started thinking, well, why wrap it with live, work, and transition to the neighbor residential to work in residential next. And looking at different types of mid-rise, 4 or 5 stories, modeling after places like Berlin or London or parts of New York next. And then looking at housing. Housing that has its own kind of network of open communal space as well as. So these are considered a series of kind of courtyards next. And then, of course, commercial buildings like hotels, and also looking at single loaded conditions and see how that affects light, air, sociability, and so on. Next. So we start thinking about phase. Like first phase, let's restore the old building, and let's put actually a sports facilities in the middle of a park. So next. And then we started growing into all the sort of recreational facilities, so create the place. And some of the recreational facilities are actually going to be phased out, like the water park or farmer's market. as other buildings are being built, and you sort of grow the recreation facilities. There are a series of pavilions for boating, cafes along the water. Next. And then we started talking about commercial, because you have to bring money in there. So these are, there's a enlarged sports center, but also a conference center, series of hotels and showrooms, sort of buildings like 200 leks. And Hungary has a really developed enological tradition. So we're talking about the wines of Hungary. So we started thinking about building, but also branding, a word I hate, but you know what that is. Next. And then started to add the live work and one more hotel at the waterfront. And next. And then finally, the housing, because we didn't want to put the housing first. The housing should have all the other support facilities. So just thinking about, this is sort of urban design on a very kind of fussy, fine-grained level. Next. Next. So this is interesting. Not all projects give satisfaction. This is a total disaster area. This is in 1987. I had just started my own office, and we had some experience in China, and we got a job in China, and we made this building. You can stylistically, you can say it's probably still has a little vestiges of that era. Anyway, next. And this is how it ended up, a total out of control. We were kicked out after schematic design. They brought in God knows who, and then they built it. We never supervised. And next. And it's still there. And it taught me a lesson. You know what? You think you experimented. You failed. You didn't get the fees. You didn't get a nice building in your portfolio. But what's worse is you put a blight on Earth. And it will sit there for who knows how long. And it's a real wake-up call. You can't brush that underneath the rug. And it really made me realize, crap, you know, there's a lot of responsibility as an architect. You know, you just can't think about career planning and just, oh, well, just not show that one. Well, anyway, I'm really airing my dirty laundry today. So, next. Well, of course, fast forward to 2005. This is Shanghai today. They've gotten much more educated there. You may be able to find some better clients, landlords, whomever, sponsors. So after almost 15 years of staying away from China and realizing that they're not ready, even though many people have gone in since and made some inroads, we said, we're not ready. So 2006, I think. So 2006, we went in, we're back in, and next. And we're looking at this and go, can't believe this is the same China that I knew from 1982. Next. You know, that amazing, actual claustrophobic, fascinating, dynamic, scary, claustrophobic, hopeful, desperate, you name it. So, next. We were approached by a very interesting company in Qingdao, where the beers comes from. And Qingdao was actually colonized by the Germans, so there's a German enclave to the old downtown, and then there's a new central business district, and it's really polarized, and everything's replicated. So we're help these people choose a site that might bridge the two. Next. This is a plan. Next. We start looking at how you move in and out and connect to the two magnets. Next. And they wanted an iconic tower. As you know, at least they didn't want a taller's tower, but they wanted a tower. And we thought, well, you know, what is a tower other than a phallic symbol? Beyond that, what else can we? So in the tradition of Chinese culture, we've always looked at our environment metaphysically, and the Chinese scholars always had a rock on the table to ponder, and the rock represents the cosmology, the mystery of the universe, and the wonderment of nature. And of course, in the Western tradition, we have also been fascinated with how to capture in the spirit of nature, the Brancusi. So we next we started looking at a building that actually has different aspects all around, so it's rotational. And we did anchor it with a residential building and a foundation of a base. The Chinese, these sort of scarlet rocks, always sits in a base, and the base it represents, in fact, the roots of being rooted onto the world. So we create a base, or in architecture speak, a podium, and filled it with social activities. But it still remains to be the focus, of course, is an iconic building, and this iconic building being inspired by a scarlet rock. It changes its character as you see them from different aspects, different angles. Next, and that's a rendering. And next, and that's the real thing. And next, and it's very prominent in the skyline. And next, and there are all kinds of bells and whistles, like these exoskeletal light fixtures that light up, and that traces the structural concept of the building, etc. Next. But it remained empty because there was no purpose for that building. The city wasn't ready for that kind of office building. The owner just had money to burn. So you know about this, it's in the papers, empty buildings everywhere. So that just, to me, made a total joke of what we did for 4 years. Next. It's not bad looking, but it's a dead corpse of a building. Next. So we retrenched and started thinking, what kind of client do we really want to work with? So we started working with local governments and see how we can actually work with their city planning and look at different sites and see how we can look at new typologies. And created 3 things. Having learned from all the past kind of forays into China, I think China is fascinating, not because it's a place where we call make some money, because they're building so much. In fact, that's, to me, the worst reason to go there. It's because China is an amazing force, and its health will affect the rest of the world. And their cultural health, even more importantly, not their economic health, will actually help bind us. And we don't, I think, help the government, who has put all their eggs in the basket that's called how to harness capitalism into their machinery, and building an economic powerhouse that's a country to dominate the rest of the world. Pretty scary. But they have totally forgotten about their own people, I think. Maybe I'm being melodramatic, but they need help. So who am I to help? So the thing is, well, somebody's got to do something, and we thought, well, why don't we start to look at some different models? So even though our investigation may be very small, we can actually start to create some directions. The issue with China is that the government wants to make a better city, but they can't build a better city without the help of the private sector. The private sector, of course, just their bottom line is profit and the easy in out, and so they can't see eye to eye as to how to create a profitable yet productive and effective environment. So this is in Dalian, another city, and we start looking at, again, they will always want to have a big damn tower somewhere because they need that huge area, profit center, FAR, density. And density is good, depends on whether you're building density that's useful. And so we're trying to see how we can make buildings that actually will be occupied, and what happens on the ground, and see how street activity and also that urban density can come together. And so this is a building where it has a subway stop, it connects to other part of town, it goes underground, it's a very cold city, it meanders through all kinds of different courtyards, so there's a very intimate scale in the street that you read one way, and the density above actually does not overwhelm. Next. So here's a street level plan. It's actually a hill, so you can come in at like 5 different elevations. Number 13 being the highest, and 15. There's a 30-foot drop. Next. I'm just racing through these. As you can see, the figure ground, there are a series of interlocking courtyard spaces you can cut through. Next. And then vertically, the mass also are pierced with public space. This building, of course, is a combination of work, transient population, aka off hotels, and then residences. A very workable mix in China to animate the building day into night. And then the gray shaded area are the public spaces, and also that section below, it's hard to read, so you go down and up and cross. Next. And this is just a picture of one piece of it. Next. So another project, also in Dalian, started to look at more clearly compare what the different densities may mean on the street alone. And we compare it to Rome, Brussels, London, New York, different pieces, and that's and accommodating for, of course, a 3-dimensional density, because the figure ground, doesn't take in considering the 3 dimension. Next. So this one combines a historical building that's in pink, there's the old school, with a series of courtyard buildings in the south in green, and then, of course, the kind of piece that densifies the city. So it's a mix of low-rise, 2 stories, to 6 stories, to 42 stories, to 17 stories. Next. High-rise building. And next. And then there are always social activities that happen on the ground. Next. So then we flipped over to something very different, which is looking at a historical piece of China. This is a restoration of a site in the Forbidden City Imperial Palace. Next. Which started that way because it was burned down during one of the revolutions. Next. And we actually restored it, working with local craftsmen with only paintings as a reference of how to reconstruct it. Next. But amazingly, parallel to all the high tech, they're still, when it comes to restoration and building in a very modest scale, the workers are still living in a very different century. Next. And in a way, and fortunate that those crafts still remain. Next. But you work with these people in a very different way that you will work with a contractor. You really create a family for the number of years that you're working with, and they're all brothers and sisters and family members. And you really have to understand them. You have to be there and understand their stories, understand their aspirations. Next. And in order to really make them do something that at the end they don't get very much out of it. I think like $20 a day. Next. Amazingly enough, they don't use the measurements as the hand. That's something I have to learn all over again. Oh, it's 4 hands, it's 3 hands. It's a finger. Next. And it just rises. Every brick was been made and glazed. Next. And you have to put up with things like that. Siesta time. Next. Nurturing younger generations. Next. Being inspired by historical materials and how to reanimate them. Next. In a form of new pieces that are inspired by it but not copied. Next. And then also to see how we insert new functions in without confusing the new and the old. And this is an observation deck, the staircase, which wouldn't have existed before, was just definitely articulated and delineated. Floors floating above the historical foundation so that you can actually remove all of these when you need to. Next, 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 next. And it goes up to next, this observation room with that roof. Next. Next. And here, again to delineate what has not been historically restored. The interiors, there's no record of interiors, so we left it completely bare. And actually, it turned out to be a pretty good background for exhibitions. Next. Next. And that's space. So what have I learned from all this, jumping around? And so the past is the past. There's only so much you can animate. The future is uncertain, but there's so many players. How do we try to create a model? So we went south to Chengdu, one of the far west. The western city is not has a very different kind of heritage because it's not seafaring. It's not part of a route, except for a route to Tibet, and they have their own very insular culture. Next. So we started this exploration. Actually, I should back up and say that there are 3 parts to our investigation into China or anywhere. One, which is the rapid urbanization, super urbanization, way beyond the biggest of our urban environments. And what does that mean? How do we deal with that? Then we see how we can dissipate this, because you can have either rural or urban. Then we are lucky to have a series of different kind of habitable landscapes, small towns, villages, of course suburbia, and second-tier cities, third-tier city, and major cities. So you have anything from New York to Boston to Pittsburgh, to the small town that I grew up in California with only 50,000 people. So we've devised 3 areas of investigation. One, which we call the urban acupuncture, which is looking at these ever-expanding cities and see how we can find critical places where we can animate it and kind of collect energies that are already there, that are dissipated or indifferent, by creating new nodes within existing fabric. And another one is actually the urban to non-urban relationships. And this is a project that deals with that. It looks at non-urban. There's a rural farmland on the pink side. It's about an hour and a half to the city. And we looked at kind of a relay of big city that's still, Chengdu is still a modest city of 10 million people. And then Dujiayan up there is 1 million people. And then finally, that rural area, Longqi, has 2,000 people. So we started looking at how you can link them together. Next. Networks and roads. Next. And you have an environment that starts in the mountainside and rural area like this. Next. Like next. To the smaller cities that looks like this. Next. And there are still, crafts and building material like this. These are dikes that they put together. A very wet area. Next. Still a lot of intact historical material being actively used. That's sort of their Rialto Bridge. It's got retail and commercial activities in it. Next. But they also have that in the big cities, right, next. So things are growing so fast, and entire areas had been torn down, and kids are like driving around like totally displaced. Next. And the new housing looks like this. And the reason is because historically the Chinese always like to face south. And when you're a low-rise courtyard, everyone can face south, and it doesn't end up looking like this. But when you end up being 10 stories, then it's just cookie cutter. Next. But the people are still very entrepreneurial. They will get their food from their farm and try to sell it in the cities. Next. They inhabit public space as if their own backyard. Next. Playing chess on the street. Next. Or even just hanging out outside the front door. So we know that there's still material, cultural material, social material we can work with. Next. And so then now looking at how to preserve the natural landscape, we've been trying to talk to the government to make it in a state or provincial park with farmlands rented back to the farmers. Next. So they don't sell it and turn it into like condo or something. And then start to look at the sustainability of it. It's the land of the pandas, so it's a very delicate ecology. Next. So we start working with local environmental planners to see how we can make more productive use of the land where it can be, and preserve natural landscape for recreational purposes. Next. You can see we're in the wildlife. There's Buffalo Wild Park, moss gardens, service centers, rest stops, and all sorts of things. So it's productive on many ways. Yeah, it's educational because people can go and look at farming. We're supporting the farmers through this initiative with the government, and the revenue from all these kind of recreational activities will then supplement the farmers' work. Next. Next. And then we looked at the kind of exurban small township, and this is an area which we're looking at different densities. Again, density being a really important thing. Both we know that the romantic notion of little villages are great, but their population's enormous. How can we do a properly dense housing and urban conditions while still preserving some of the cultural and social phenomenons, like how they interact with each other. And so these are various studies looking at, I'm not going to go into it, zoning and so on. Next. But just like show you that from designing some fabulous curtains or some sofa or some beautiful residential to crunching numbers and looking at densities, that's all part of a day's work for architects, right? And this is actually a retirement facilities for aging monks in Bhutan. And there, basically, we're taking existing Bhutanese architectural typologies and traditions and construction methodologies and leaving alone, try to improve best practices by just helping them understand how it can be more productive and effective in their ways without introducing new technologies per se. And then looking at, again, social interaction by clustering. And then we went to Bhutan, we got to get out of China for a while and just clear our head. And next. And so looking at different clustering, 6 monks to a bungalow, 4 bungalows to a cluster. And there's a head guy, there's a public sort of communal space that has a clinic and some concession and library and so on. Next. And then again, working, as I said, to improve their quality, not only of quality of their building, but quality of their lives while building the building. So next. They've never used a plumb line or just simple things like that. Next. So That's not our building. That's a building that we use as a kind of investigatory exercise and see how it's built, and so we can learn from that and then create much simpler buildings next. And so then we start looking at some kind of prefab for them next. And because otherwise it'll be very arbitrary next. And this is the way they live now. So in a way, you can't just like throw them into the 21st century, even if they have all the money in the world. It's just too shocking. So we're trying to help them organize from that world how to improve incrementally next. And then working with the monks and making them understand what it is we're trying to do next. So finally, we decided that we don't want to work for our developers anymore in China. So at home, my brother is an entrepreneur, but he's also been working in China and noticed that all the dysfunctions and also the potential that's there. So we decided to do our own thing. So he's going to come up with the dough and sweet talk the government officials, and we're trying to scheme something. So now we're really thinking about content as well as the container, the architecture's container, what happens in there that can really animate. So this is a tiny little acupuncture gesture into Shanghai. It's only 20,000 square feet. We rented the space from the local government next. And this is the environment now. It's a 50s building, but modeled after still courtyards and alleyways. And so the entries are there, and you go through a covered alleyway into a courtyard. So in a way, the DNA of that building is very much part of Chinese building typologies. But we want to use it in a contemporary way. It's actually a social hub. We have children's creative learning. We have daycare. We have mind-body alignment. We have a dialogue facilitation. People like helping families negotiate their differences. There are a lot of generational conflict. They don't believe in shrinks, so we are devising a new way of helping people dialogue and communicate. The culture is changing by the nanosecond, right? So someone 50 years old to someone who's 18-year-old, and we think we have a generation gap. They're like out of control, right? So the older people feel like they're on Mars. The young people are frustrated because the things are going not fast enough. The people our age are thinking, oh my God, what am I going to wake up to tomorrow? So it's really not a very happy place right now. And they're inebriating themselves with consumerism. So we want to just give them a new way to consume services rather than products, consume each other's company, and how do we create a place that actually make them feel connected to each other. So the model is like a clubhouse. You know, you buy in and you can come and hang out and you can use these facilities. You can park your child. You can come in and drag your husband in and talk about why, whatever. Bitch about your in-law. Worry about your job. There's a thing called, like work management program that we're devising that my brother knows too well. He's a businessman. He's bringing, I think, McGill University's business management course in personal life management and work management. And, so he's dealing with everybody's problems, issues, but in a fun sort of way. So we have a rooftop farm that kids can come and play. The rooftop farm is supplying a all-day eatery that we're putting on the street. The menu is based on blood type eating, so you can eat right by your DNA, but at the same time, trying to introduce this as a scientific way of looking at Chinese herbal cures, which actually deals with the same thing. So there's a kind of bringing their heritage by using 21st century explanations. There's an art therapy and music therapy courses. There's yoga, Pilates. So it's creating kind of a a way of life in a small space. Next. So, these are classrooms, there's a lecture hall. We're going to bring different kind of interest groups to come talk about a variety of different topics. There's a cooking demonstration place, so you can learn how to cook that DNA stuff. Next. And movement studio, yoga studio, so on and so forth. Next. And we had to fix the outside, so of course we're not trying to make it ersatz Chinese anything. Next. And of course the most important thing is that kind of heart, which is the courtyard with the restaurant and the children's play area, and all the offerings are upstairs. Next. On a larger scale, we're working with the Suzhou government on the lake that is famous for their crabs, which are unique to that area. And so we're creating a learning center for preservation of crabs and sustainability of the environment, but also creating housing and a school. Next. And so we have about roughly 100 attached houses, 100 apartments that caters to an aging community with healthcare provisos. And then again, children's component where you bring children play. There are basically what I just described in the city, but an expanded version. So these are our current obsessions, is how to animate architecture and built environment through social activities and engineering some kind of way of animating life. Next. So that's in the night. And that's where we're stopped, because that's it. Now, I have just one quickly, I know that everybody's yawning, it's very boring, is that after all of this, I think we all have to ask ourselves, why do we do what we do anyway? What gets up in the morning? Is it money? Is it fame? Is it fortune? What is it? And I think that, so I want to show you some pictures that are really that makes me go on and try different things again and again, and I'm damn it, I'm gonna get it right one day. Can you turn to the next page? And let me just do the punching because it needs a certain rhythm. So just this one, right? Page down?
No.
Page up, no, this one. And that's it. Thank you.
Open up to a few questions, please. Thank you very much. I think it was a great talk, and it also talks about one of the things I admire most is your sensitivity to situations, and what you're also striving to do in China. On that note, though, let me ask, are there any questions? Questions? Is there someone back there? I can't see. Well, while they're all, our students, since you have to have practice, have to ask some questions. Well, they're thinking for a moment. My question is, going back to the project you're doing with your brother, that project, where is it in terms of phasing? Is it renovated? It's in the clubhouse, so to speak.
It's opening in 2 months. And you're all invited. Yeah. I mean, if we fuck up, we have no one to blame. We have no one to blame. No, but I don't think we screwed up anything yet. And I think the neighborhood has been really fascinated because we've been, under wraps for about 9 months, which by Chinese standards is like a lifetime. And they wonder, like, why is this little tiny space take so long? We can do this in 6 weeks. So, so we kept them guessing, and we actually have a little website for people who was wondering, and said, well, if you want to know more about this, well, if you walk by, just kind of come and look around. So. Yeah, everything. Soups to nuts, down to the napkins in the restaurant. So it's total control.
Are there other questions? Because I have another one. You gotta come on. You gotta get in practice. Your interiors that you showed at first, they're unbelievably exquisite. Are they all in the States? Are they all over the world? And how do you manage the money? Those all look very, very beautiful, very expensive, juxtaposed to how you approach projects, let's say, in China.
Well, we're an equal opportunity. We don't reject wealthy or poor people. No, but it's really based on aspirations. I mean, we all are on our own level, have our dreams and our wishes and our desires, and as long as it does no harm, I think you have every level of opportunity. I mean, when a patron who has resources to help you explore things, for me, it doesn't stop there. They explore with these very privileged people. We always make them help us develop things and research things so we can actually apply to people who can't afford that kind of research. And so there's use. We're passing it along. So they're not just all standalone, exquisite things to be enjoyed just by the people themselves. The knowledge and the insight that we learn from doing those projects are for all to share. And I think you learn about psychologies in it. And a wealthy person and poor person, we're all haunted by the same things, so. Okay, any other questions? Or we will go downstairs and have a reception, and you should, yes, please. Wait, no, let me give you this.
The building that you said you considered a failure, what determines that? What defines the building as a failure to you?
Well,
is it just
first,
a bad experience, or?
Well, experience can be bad whether the building is successful. In fact, all experiences are rocky. Well, first of all, the other project where the fancy building that we got built and looks nice, to me is a failure too, because if nobody uses it, what's the point of all that effort, right? So that office tower in Qingdao, just sitting there, I think maybe now there's some people in there. But that one, well, as you know, from like 60 Minutes, there are buildings that are built for speculation, and people don't really live there. And we designed that building to be used, so it was sold. But at the same time, because bought and no one lived there, it started to deteriorate. And the developer basically took the money from the sales and ran with it, did not form even a management company to maintain the building, let alone try to create a community within that building. And we did. We have rooftop gardens, we had community spaces. They're all empty. You know, so, and no one lives there. And it starts to fall apart, and it's an eyesore, to say the least. So is that failure enough?
More questions before we go downstairs? Any? Yes.
Oh, all of a sudden.
Oh, okay.
Do you still agree to do these projects, even though later their, you know, their future is maybe not to be used?
Well, if I know from the get-go, hell no. I was roped into that, suckered in. You just don't know. You know, you really don't know. People can give you a really great spin. And I have to say, this is one thing I like about being older. We are wiser, smarter, and you can't fool me no more. So, you know, that's a good thing. You know, I can read people a lot more. That are they sincere? Do they really mean it? Are they pulling my leg? I get it, you know, whether they're Germans or Chinese or New Yorkers.
Okay. A question back there. Could we get the mic over there?
As a established architect, I just want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the growing trend in China of these, basically they're like ghost towns that they create? Like, you know how China has, they put in a lot of money into building these really big,
Oh, thank you.
they put money into building all these buildings, and but nobody lives in there. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the things that I'm doing with my brother, little tiny things, is a way to counter that, because I think the only way to show people are, if they are not given choices, they can only do what they have. And so the Chinese learn very well, like they're not stupid, but they're very smart. But if you're kept down and you're always given the same thing, they can't really say, but I want this instead. So what we're hoping to do is creating different options for people so they can see and go, wait a minute, this is good. Why can't I have that? You know, and so you create a market demand. I think developers or commercial business people are not that they're there to screw you per se. They just want to make the money quickly and without really thinking too hard. So they do market research, which means, or validation, which is whatever's out there, I'll do more of it. And so they're looking for new ideas. You know, I mean, I do infiltrate and go to like developers conferences and things like that. And I put on a much nicer suit than this. And I pass out business cards. And I listen to them, and they're all kind of go, well, I don't know where the next level is, and we just kind of fight the next level is, but I don't want to take the risk, and I want to not try anything new, because then if I fail, that's major money. So we don't mind failing, as you can see, and we are able to find interesting ways of getting investors. So no one's out of pocket a lot. You're not going to Lehman Brothers or Goldman Sachs or some major bank and that was going to tie you down and you have nowhere to go. I don't know whether you know these things. But anyway, I found out. So they're kind of screwed too by the banks and by the investment people, the finance people, the fund managers, real estate funds and all that stuff. So they can't move unless they do the same damn thing. And the people buy the same damn thing. And that's why they're empty, because they go, I don't need this. But also because the reason why China, all these buildings are not being used, they're not really about living. They are actually commodities. They are stocks in a stock market, except they're houses and apartments. And so the China's system is that you make money, you put it in the bank, not enough interest rate is not good. So where do you park their money? So they're used to owning land. So they transfer the desire to own something concrete as a investment in owning apartments and other, contemporary counterparts. And so this is not something we should talk about, actually, because it's about the politics of business and money and finance and economics, which we all should know about and then get around it. But they're trapped in their own kind of vicious cycle. But what we can do is get a different kind of resource, build a different kind of product that if we fail, it's not, high stakes, and then we can do something. I think being a David to their Goliath is the only way to go.
Well, that's a very metaphoric end to this evening. So I want to thank you, and let's all go downstairs and enjoy a reception and take the opportunity to talk to Calvin.